civic memory, and public arts. He was the architectural critic for the Los Angeles Times from 2004 to 2018, and has also been featured in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and many others. In addition to being a co-author of The Greenhouse, New Directions in Sustainable Architecture, Christopher has also collaborated with KCET-TV, earning 2 Emmys for his documentary on architecture and urbanism in Los Angeles. Please give Christopher Hawthorne a big hand and welcome him to the stage and support.
Thank you.
Thank you, James. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? All right. Never the easiest to do the first talk on a Sunday morning, so I'll do my best to bring some energy. Thank you so much for the welcome, for the hospitality, for the invitation to be here with you this morning. As James mentioned, I did spend almost 15 years as the architecture critic at the Los Angeles Times. I then spent almost 5 years as the first chief design officer for the city of LA, which was a position appointed by Mayor Eric Garcetti, and really grew out of Mayor Garcetti's interest in and knowledge of architecture, design, urban planning. He really wanted to have a single voice looking at all of the design projects that the city was working on. So it was quite a leap from journalism, the world of criticism, to the world of city government. But there was some continuity in terms of how I had been writing about and understanding Los Angeles. And that's what I would like to talk with you a little bit about this morning, about some of the projects I worked on in LA, but more to the point, the urbanism of Los Angeles, the elusiveness of Los Angeles as a subject, and perhaps the ways that Los Angeles might serve as a model for thinking about some of the challenges that cities around the world face in the 21st century. As Jay mentioned, I moved about 2 years ago to New Haven to start teaching at the Yale School of Architecture, where I teach classes on criticism, history, and theory. And some of the themes in this talk are very much part of what I'm teaching in terms of thinking about contemporary urbanism and urban design, again, informed by my experience in City Hall in Los Angeles. So I want to start actually by talking about how elusive, how slippery Los Angeles has been as a subject. There's a long literature of writers arriving in Los Angeles, as Karen McWilliams did in the 1940s, and expressing confusion, if not outright hatred for the place, as he put it. When I first arrived in Los Angeles, I hated, as so many other people have hated, the big, sprawling, deformed character of the place. And he said that it took him what he described as 7 long years of exile to really begin to understand Los Angeles. Charles Moore, the great postmodern architect, who was the dean at both UC Berkeley and at Yale School of Architecture, wrote a terrific guidebook to Los Angeles architecture in the 1980s, which I really recommend to you. If you don't know it, his writing, Charles Moore's writing, really holds up as well as, or perhaps better than, the architecture. He suggested that Los Angeles needed, as he put it, a different plan of attack in terms of thinking about urban design, planning, architecture, or even, I think in a basic way, even understanding the city. And most famously, the poet Ogden Nash wrote in a poem that was published in the New Yorker called "Don't Shoot Los Angeles" in 1942, described Los Angeles as a cloudburst of non sequiturs, one of my favorite phrases about LA, suggesting the kind of diffuse nature of it and the inability to get a firm fix on it as a city. Of course, it's important to point out that this is not a universal, this is not a set of conditions that is unique to Los Angeles. A lot of cities across the American Southwest, I think San Diego and Tijuana to a degree, and certainly a lot of cities in Texas and Florida have some of these same conditions in terms of slipperiness and elusiveness. But it is the literature of urbanism in Los Angeles that has made most clear that Los Angeles, in certain ways, in the second half of the 20th century in particular, was emerging as a new kind of city, which was difficult for, let's say, traditional observers of urbanism and city making to understand. Mike Davis described Los Angeles, again, quite famously, as a city without boundaries, a city which ate the desert, cut down the Joshua and the Maypole, and dreamt of becoming infinite. And it's that dreaming of becoming infinite that I think has really changed, and one of the things that we'll be talking a lot about this morning. So keep that phrase in mind. The architecture of Los Angeles really also reflects to a large degree this dream, and many of the most important landmarks in Los Angeles are paradoxically enough seem to represent Los Angeles precisely by their detachment or estrangement from it. This is the observatory. So this quality of being in the city and being separate from the city are the most important landmarks of LA. This is one of my favorite photographs of Los Angeles, showing the parking lot of Dodger Stadium. And those of you who know Dodger Stadium know that, again, paradoxically, you sort of have to leave Los Angeles to enter this quintessentially Los Angeles piece of architecture, despite the fact that it's right close to downtown. The Civic Center is less than a mile from City Hall, for example. Perhaps most memorably of all, the photographer Julia Schulman again captured this sense of the Los Angeles landmark being representing the city by being detached from it and keeping the rest of the city at arm's length. So this is one of the case study houses, the Stahl House from 1960 by the architect Pierre Koenig. And this photograph sort of suggests the observer of Los Angeles at the window, again, representing LA by being above and apart from it. And if you take that trajectory to its extreme, you get an image like this one of the great David Hockney pictures of Los Angeles, A Bigger Splash, where the observer has disappeared entirely, and there's no one left to kind of make sense of the city. The diver has gone below the surface of the water. So there are some ways, though, that we can think about how Los Angeles stands in for some contemporary movements in urbanism, and we can flip this sort of exoticism about Los Angeles on its head, that rather than being elusive or anomalous, standing apart from other cities, Los Angeles actually stands in for a number of the most important trends in urbanism. The first one is that Los Angeles is organized as a grid rather than a network, and we see all kinds of ways in which the world operates that way these days. This is something that was pointed out in the literature of Los Angeles as early as the 1970s, when Rainer Banham, the great London-based architectural historian and critic, wrote a book called Los Angeles, the Architecture of Four Ecologies. And he suggested that the point about Los Angeles is that it had grown almost simultaneously all over, that all its parts are equal and equally accessible from all other parts at once. And then, in a phrase that I really love, he suggested at the end of this quote that the way that you move in and out of Los Angeles is by an almost random or Brownian motion over the whole area, rather than moving into a downtown and out of a downtown, as we would think about mobility in a more traditionally organized city. And that notion was actually fixed in some of the planning documents of Los Angeles as early as 1970. This is a plan that's known as the Centers Plan, produced by the Department of City Planning in Los Angeles, which essentially fixed in policy the polycentric quality of Los Angeles, the idea that there was no one center of LA, that LA was a multimodal or multinodal city. It's also important to point out that this document, while kind of enshrining the idea of a polycentric Los Angeles in planning policy, also is meant very much to protect development in single-family zones against denser new development or growth. And so these nodes marked by the circles in this image were meant to be the repositories of new dense development, protecting some of the single-family neighborhoods, and that certainly has repercussions in terms of housing affordability or lack thereof in Los Angeles in 2024. And certainly we see this sort of networked quality being one way to map the rest of the world these days. The internet, of course, it goes without saying, is organized very much along the lines of Los Angeles, but so are the kind of infrastructural systems that support digital culture, like fiber optic cables, for example. It's easy enough to think that the multipolar nature of Los Angeles has something to do with the freeways, and that's certainly part of one's experience of LA, one's sense that LA doesn't have a single center. But it's important to point out that historically there are deeper roots. Like a lot of cities, Los Angeles had quite an extensive streetcar network predating the freeway system. It had probably the most extensive mass transit system in the world around 1920. And so this also, these lines of the streetcar network actually fixed some of the rights of way that became freeways, but also kind of fixed in a mobility map the kind of polycentric nature of Los Angeles that we have been talking about. It's, again, important to keep in mind that Los Angeles, though we associate it so clearly with the car and with car culture, actually had a kind of urbanism and a kind of street life that predated both car ownership and the construction of that freeway network that I just showed. So these images which show downtown Los Angeles, Broadway and 7th is this intersection, if you know downtown LA from the 1920s. Had exactly the kind of multimodal urbanism that so many cities, including LA, are trying to get back to, which is to say streetcars, pedestrians, cyclists, and private cars were all mixed together in a very dense kind of street life, very much at odds with all of the kind of tropes or cliches about Los Angeles as a city where no one walks, no one takes public transit, a city without a kind of street life. I think second idea to explore, particularly important in an era of climate change and of climate crisis, is the relationship of Los Angeles to disaster and its relationship both culturally and in terms of its urbanism to issues related to disaster. Of course, because Los Angeles is the center of world film production, Los Angeles has continually been destroyed over and over again by Hollywood. This is one of just hundreds of movies that I could have chosen. Volcano, it shows the eruption and destruction of Wilshire Boulevard. Those of you who know Los Angeles, on the right side of this image is the old version of the Peterson Automotive Museum at Wilshire and Fairfax. At left is the May Company building, now the Academy Museum. So this is also where LACMA is. And of course, increasingly we see images from the news that suggest that this apocalyptic Hollywood portrayal is being reflected increasingly because of wildfire risk and other climate dangers in the day-to-day reality of life in Los Angeles and Southern California. It's always useful to go back to the literature of Los Angeles, which is much richer along these lines than I think most people give it credit for. There's a great book from the 1960s by Richard Lillard called Eden and Jeopardy, and he argues that Los Angeles has always been what he calls the pace setter in catastrophe, and I think we see that in Hollywood and elsewhere. And this has had real implications for, again, going back before the mid-century era to the first decades of the 20th century. This has really always had a direct impact on the infrastructure of Los Angeles. Los Angeles was organized around the Los Angeles River. The original indigenous Tongva settlements were located where they were because of proximity to the river, and downtown Los Angeles, present-day downtown LA, is where it is because of the river. And the Los Angeles River provided, I should say, the drinking water for Los Angeles up until 1913. So it was deeply connected to the life of the city, but it was a seasonal river that often flooded in the winter, and a number of deadly floods, particularly bad in the 1930s, led to the channelization of the entire 51 miles of the Los Angeles River, which again, as filtered through Hollywood, has produced some of the most recognizable images of a particular kind of LA urbanism, again, detached from the kind of street life we saw in the 1920s. This is John Borman's film Point Blank from 1967. And we see this kind of imagery now, I think, because of the climate crisis, beginning to show up in how other cities understand themselves. To me, this is the most representative image of New York City over the last 2 decades or so. This is Ewan Bond, the architectural photographer's shot of Manhattan, lower Manhattan after Hurricane Sandy. So Ewan got up in a helicopter to shoot the lack of power, lack of light in much of lower Manhattan after Sandy. But this is also a picture that suggests something about equity and inequity, because some of the lights that you can see around Wall Street and the financial center are the few buildings that were able to keep power on, including the Goldman Sachs headquarters and other buildings, suggesting those kinds of gaps in access to power after a disaster like Sandy. I think significantly for how urbanism and the understanding of city making is changing, at least in the American context, there has always been, of course, in Los Angeles, a sense that we understand Los Angeles and the American continent by moving west. It's an old manifest destiny and sort of colonial idea. And I think Los Angeles, during the period that I was there, was very much beginning to try to break free from the shadow of that kind of thinking and that kind of logic. Of course, this is deeply embedded in American culture, this idea that we understand the United States experiment in terms of Western expansion across the continent, and Los Angeles and San Diego as well also qualifies from this point of view as the kind of endpoint of territorial expansion across the American West, of course, occluding and in some cases obliterating existing cultures and histories along the way. You don't have to read this. I will just explain that when I did a series of essays on the boulevards of Los Angeles, one of the conceits that I used was I wrote a piece on Sunset Boulevard. Sunset Boulevard, like the American continent, had always been understood in the literature of urbanism from east to west. Every essay, every film, every study of Sunset Boulevard that I could find started in downtown or started on the east side of Los Angeles in Boyle Heights and moved west. Even the name of the city, of the street, Sunset, suggests that you're supposed to understand it that way by heading toward the sunset. So I wrote a piece kind of thinking about Sunset Boulevard beginning at the ocean and just turning that trajectory around as a way of flipping that script and trying to upend some of these notions, which again are so deeply embedded in a certain American understanding of Los Angeles's relationship to the rest of the country. Again, just by that sort of narrative flip, was able to think about the meaning and importance of the boulevard from that point of view. Now, of course, it's important to understand that there are the limitations of that understanding of Los Angeles as the westernmost endpoint of American territorial expansion and manifest destiny, has always misunderstood the ways that Los Angeles can be read. If you're thinking about a north-south or a different kind of trajectory, and my former colleague at the Los Angeles Times, Carolina Miranda, wrote a great piece for the journal Guernica in 2019, where she suggested it makes more sense to think of LA as the northernmost capital of Latin America or the easternmost capital of Asia. And that's something that Mayor Garcetti also talked about. And that elusiveness that I started the talk with, the ways in which Los Angeles is slippery as a subject, I think begin to fade when you're looking at Los Angeles from a different point of view. If you've been trained to understand cities in a place like Chicago or New York or London or Paris, you will, I think, have a tough time immediately understanding LA. If you have spent time in Mexico City or Lima or Santiago or Seoul or other Asian capitals, the urbanism of Los Angeles tends to be much more legible. And I think that's one of the arguments that Carolina was making in this piece. Similarly, I think the notion of upending these trajectories of Western expansion is part of a lot of the ways that our understanding of cities is being rewritten. One of the biggest changes in Los Angeles over the last 10 years or so has been the end of population growth in LA and its implications for how we understand and think about the city. And this is a fundamental challenge in certain ways to how we have always understood Los Angeles. Los Angeles has seen growth and what some policymakers call the growth machine as fundamental to its identity, and in fact, a kind of commodity that we have sold to the rest of the world, that we are always growing. I'm sorry, this image got got messed up, but the basic change is that after more than a century, almost a century and a half of steady growth beginning in the 1880s, Los Angeles is now beginning to see its population decline for the first time. And this has everything to do, it's important to note, with housing affordability. Families leaving, households leaving Los Angeles in search, for the most part, of more affordable housing. The Black population in the city of Los Angeles, for example, has declined since 1980 by more than 25%, almost 30%. A really significant blow to the kind of civic identity of Los Angeles, the culture of LA, and again, it has almost everything to do with housing affordability. And so that is a challenge that is, I think, being replicated across the globe as we think about birth patterns. This idea of growth as a kind of implicit goal for the ways in which we organize our cities is very much coming into question as we see some of the same demographic patterns that have been shifting in Los Angeles begin to shift on a global basis. The last category that I want to talk about, and it's here that I'll bring in some of the work that I did in City Hall in Los Angeles, is really thinking about how LA might reckon more productively with its past, particularly those elements of its past that are fraught or difficult to talk about, or have been whitewashed or buried in some of the ways that we have written about or talked about Los Angeles. Los Angeles has always understood itself as a city of the future. This has something to do, again, with being the capital of the entertainment business and having Hollywood located there. It has been a place where people come to reinvent themselves. It has been a place, in terms of its civic gaze, always being fixed on the future, looking ahead rather than looking behind. And this is encapsulated by this Ed Ruscha piece from the 1980s. And again, we go back to this Mike Davis quote, this dream of Los Angeles of being infinite. Also, the flip side of that is a lack of attention to the city's past, particularly where that past, again, as I mentioned, is fraught or has been buried. So one of the major projects that we initiated when I was in the mayor's office was what we called the Civic Memory Working Group. We invited a number of historians, architects, designers, indigenous leaders, many of my colleagues from city government, to join us to work through and produce a series of recommendations on this question of how Los Angeles might grapple more productively, more honestly with its past. And this, of course, had something to do with the conversation that was happening nationally in the United States about monuments and memorials, and indeed globally. As Confederate monuments were being taken down in the American South. And in the Los Angeles context, there were beginning to be debates about what to do with particular monuments and memorials that represented pain or hardship for certain communities. But more broadly, we really wanted to open up the dialogue and think about how, again, this city that had so much been focused on the future could turn its attention in policy making and design work to this question of a better stewardship of the past and more equitable stewardship. And in part, this informed, so just to go back, this group of about 36 issues that we convened in City Hall produced a report in the spring of 2021, which had a number of very specific policy recommendations, but also really was meant to open up conversations about difficult subjects like histories of enslavement in Los Angeles, histories of incarceration on a racial basis, and some of the, and I would say also the legacies of Spanish colonialism across the region as well. So that was released in the spring of 2021, and that helped inform a number of civic conversations around, again, difficult anniversaries. We helped organize a number of conversations about the 30th anniversary of the civic uprising that followed the acquittal of the police officers in the LAPD who were accused of beating Rodney King, as we neared that 30th anniversary. And it also has helped us think about and shed light on particular elements in the city's history that have not been particularly, that have largely been forgotten, including This is an image of the so-called Mexican repatriation, which many of you in the audience may be familiar with in the 1930s in the depths of the Depression. More than 100,000 Mexican Americans and Mexican residents of Los Angeles were relocated to Mexico, despite many of them, a majority of them, being citizens of the United States. And that retelling that story and unearthing that story has led to projects like this one, which is now an audio tour that you can take in downtown Los Angeles to learn about the historical context of that repatriation, which again, given current debates in Los Angeles and across the United States about immigration, seems as relevant as ever. We're digging into in this project histories where there's a very clear overlap between what we think of as land use or urban design policy, city making, and questions of inequity. So, like many cities, the redlining maps of Los Angeles paint a very clear picture of the ways in which Black potential home buyers of color were excluded from much of the opportunities for wealth building that existed in cities like Los Angeles across the 20th century. And in fact, if you superimpose this map of redlining on a contemporary map of Los Angeles, it maps very neatly, sad to say, with other measures of contemporary inequity. Even it maps very clearly with the locations of shade and lack of shade in the city, access to jobs, housing, et cetera. So these policy and lending decisions that we made now nearly a century ago continue to reverberate in terms of present day inequality. And the architecture of the city represents this as well. The most prominent Black architect of 20th century Los Angeles, Paul Williams, was designing single-family houses all over the city, often in neighborhoods where he would not be allowed to buy a house, even in some cases neighborhoods where he was not allowed to spend the night as an African American. So when it came time for him to design a house for himself and his own family, he built a house in a center of African American culture, Lafayette Park, which allowed him also a little more leeway in terms of architecture. His houses for those wealthy white clients tended to be more historically minded, and he was able to explore themes connected to particularly the history of modern architecture in Los Angeles in this residence. So to close, just a few comments about, again, to get back to one of the central areas of focus of this civic memory group was the fate of monuments and memorials. And of course, we're all familiar with images like this one, which spread around the world in 2020 and 2021. This is a group of protesters throwing a statue of Edward Colston, who was a slave owner in the UK, into Bristol Harbor. And what we've begun to see in other cities, and what we really looked to was we were studying this set of questions in Los Angeles, was an effort to build a new generation of monuments and memorials that might better reflect those histories that had not been told. And this is one by the Congolese artist Samy Balogi in Antwerp, which is really directly confronting the imperial history of Belgium in Congo and the extraction of resources and wealth from Congo in a way that really made modern Belgium what it is, in this attempt to put right at the harbor in Antwerp a kind of reckoning with that history by Congolese artists is an important part of that story. But more the case, I mean, we saw this image of monuments that are actually taken down, sometimes forcibly, sometimes cities are proactively taking down monuments, memorials. Sometimes we're producing new ones. I think more often we will need to figure out how to recontextualize rather than remove entirely difficult monuments and memorials. This is also an example from Belgium where a Congolese artist was invited into the Grand Hall of this Central Africa, a Royal Museum for Central Africa in Belgium, where these figures in gold in all of the niches around this rotundus are celebrating this kind of imperial plunder of Congo. And the decision was made not to remove them, but to try to add some context by inviting contemporary artists in to grapple with that difficult history. Similarly, in Los Angeles, this is a project that came out of the civic memory work that I want to conclude with. because it is ongoing and it suggests where this work, I think, might go from here. The deadliest episode of racial violence in Los Angeles history, and this still ranks as the deadliest single day, was the murder of roughly 10% of the Chinese population of Los Angeles in 1871. And I had heard that figure. What I didn't realize is that also the mob that perpetrated that violence was made up of 10% of the entire population of Los Angeles in 1871. So a city of about 5,000 people, 500 people were engaged in this mob violence that killed somewhere between 18 and 22. The historical record is not clear. All men, Chinese immigrants who had been working in downtown and living in downtown Los Angeles. So when we were working on the Civic Memory Project, we heard from the Chinese American community that there was a very strong desire to have a much more prominent marker to memorialize and remember the victims of that 1871 violence. So informed again by the recommendations of that Civic Memory Working Group, which really was about listening to communities and helping communities hearing how communities wanted to tell their own stories. What we heard again and again in the civic memory work is that too often the city of Los Angeles was acting as a gatekeeper, sort of deciding which stories would be told, and that there was a desire to have the city instead be a kind of facilitator of community aspiration in terms of what stories might be better told, unearthed, and what lives might be remembered. So we heard from the Chinese American community repeatedly that they wanted a more prominent marker of this violence to remember the victims, and they wanted the city to spearhead that effort because they wanted some kind of reckoning on the part of the city of Los Angeles officially with those deaths. So we began with a series of workshops with the community. Mayor Garcetti issued the first formal apology on behalf of the city for that violence. And then we began thinking about what a design might look like of a new memorial. So we put out a request for ideas to gather proposals from design teams around the world. We were really overwhelmed by the response, and a jury that I took part in chose a proposal by a pair of artists, Nicholas Leong and Judy Chung, that really very carefully remembers and commemorates those victims along Los Angeles Street. This is also, I think, going to be, I hope, a model for, here's another image, a new kind of monument, not only because of the community engagement that we engaged in, that we organized around this question, but also because the violence on the day in 1871 when these victims were killed was distributed across much of the geography of the Los Angeles of 1871. And there were also several sites of sanctuary. There were several sites where property owners in Los Angeles opened up their houses or their, in one case, a vineyard to Chinese. The designer of this memorial, that the memorial also reflect the distributed nature of the event, both in terms of its violence and in terms of those sites of sanctuary. So in addition to the primary site of the memorial here, which is very close to a plaza and the Chinese American Museum in downtown Los Angeles on the edge of Chinatown, their proposal also calls for a number of other sites to be marked as part of this distributed memorial that you can then will be connected by some kind of an audio or digital walking tour that will take visitors through a number of these sites, rather than just having, as is the traditional approach to monuments and memorials, a figure on horseback on a plinth or a statue of usually a white man in the middle of the square. This is quite a different approach in all kinds of ways, but I think really different, starting with its roots in the kind of community conversations that were organized to hear what the aspiration was for what this memorial might look like. So just to close, I think there are a lot of ways in which Los Angeles now, rather than being kind of this anomalous, slippery subject, can really help us understand changes that are happening in cities across the world. Thank you so much for your attention. Appreciate it. Happy to take some questions.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much. I just have one question for you before I hand it to the audience. I'm just the insights that you gleaned from your time as chief design officer of LA in terms of what are those insights that can be applied to our broad region here of Tijuana and San Diego?
Thank you for the question. I think the biggest one is that so many of the challenges that we face, and I would just focus on two for the purposes of answering your question, housing and dealing with the climate crisis, really leak and spread beyond municipal and jurisdictional boundaries. So in the Los Angeles case, we were working on housing policy, emergency housing for the homeless. That was something I was quite a bit on, as well as thinking about strategies for new kinds of mobility, getting people out of their cars, for example, which has been a challenge in Los Angeles for a long time. But in terms of policy making to address those chief challenges, Los Angeles sits, the city of 4 million people, sits in a county of 10 million people, and sits in a metropolitan region of close to 20 million people. And residents are crossing those jurisdictional borders all the time without necessarily paying attention to them. So the coordination across city, county, let's say state and federal questions is one of the toughest things to coordinate, because just to give an example from the housing crisis, cities that we don't have control over within, that LA does not have control over within LA County, Santa Monica and Culver City, to pick two examples, have become real job magnets, but they're not producing housing to keep up with that. So in Santa Monica, for example, across the last 10 years or so, the city of Santa Monica has produced something like 10 jobs for every one housing unit that it has built. Culver City, something similar. And it's really the city of Los Angeles and the rest of LA County that bears the brunt for housing the people who come in to work those jobs. It's politically easier to make room for new job creation than it is for new housing, for all kinds of reasons that I'm sure many people here are familiar with. And then similar with transportation policy, the mass transit policy in Los Angeles is set by a county organization that, of course, has a board that the mayor of Los Angeles gets to appoint some seats to, but that kind of coordination. And I think regionally here in San Diego, across, you just think about that complexity of that just becoming so much greater when you're talking about crossing a national border like you have here. So I think American cities in particular are very poor at thinking about that coordination of let's say, local and regional, and I'm sure that continues to be an issue here as well.
I'll take questions. Go to the front here. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you so much for that. I don't think most country culture in the city of San Diego.
Pleasure.
Daniel Roselle, texting.
Oh, great.
I have kind of a wonky question. So you said inside the mayor's office in Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
Let me back up. So one of the tenants of organizations that want to be the capital cities with a design office.
Mm-hmm.
And so in our region of two major cities, we're having a conversation of what is the best use, what is the role, when we place this thing, and how do you protect it through various thoughtful administration.
Mm-hmm.
So in a city like San Diego or Los Angeles, where you have a department of public affairs and planning, you have a very strong mobility and sustainability department. Where does the design office and office of design,
Mm-hmm.
what is the best way to position a design office actually to lead the work of all?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's a great question, one that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. I should back up and say that there are several other cities that have had similar positions to mine. So Helsinki has had a chief design officer. The city of Auckland had one. Going back to Mayor John Lindsay in New York City in the 1970s, he created an urban design studio that actually did some really pioneering work, particularly related to air rights in Manhattan. That continues to, I think, have some significant effects in terms of development in New York City. And there is now in Mayor Eric Adams' administration in New York City a kind of chief urban realm director who is just a few months into her position. But this question of it really depends on what the goals of the project are. In my case, I was in the mayor's office. I was appointed directly by Mayor Garcetti. It reflected, as I said earlier, his particular interest and expertise in these issues and his desire to elevate these questions within his administration. Now, there are benefits and downsides to that location, and I can talk through them a little bit in terms of how you're thinking about it from the perspective of San Diego, because these are really crucial questions. I think the overarching answer is there's no perfect position. You have to decide what your priorities are. The benefits of being in the mayor's office is that in LA, all of the departments report to the mayor. They serve at the mayor's pleasure, although they also complicatedly work with the individual city council members. But in terms of setting policy across the city, there was a real benefit in having my position be in the mayor's office, particularly for its convening power to bring together different departments. And particularly when I was working on issues related to, let's say, shade, for example. I did a lot of projects related to shade equity, thinking of shade as infrastructure. Again, thinking about bringing shade to, as temperatures increase, parts of the city that hadn't had them. And that was really an effort that required coordination across many departments in the city, so cultural affairs, but also public work, a number of public works departments, as well as city planning. So it was very helpful to have the perspective of being in the mayor's office to think about that kind of coordination, which is, as I'm sure is true in most cities, is not always as fluid across those departmental lines as it could be. The benefit of having a position that's embedded within a department, which is how cities have done it, and how Los Angeles has done it with other positions. We have chief forestry officers thinking about tree canopy, for example, again, related to the shade question. Her position is within the Department of Public Works and is not a mayor's office position. So those that are in individual departments have the benefit of not having to worry about the change of administrations at the mayoral level, but they sometimes, I think, struggle with that convening power. So I think the perfect response would be, the perfect setup would be, and some cities have done this with sustainability, where you have a chief sustainability officer in the mayor's office, and then you have chief sustainability officers, often with a dual appointment in each of the major departments. And so with part of their portfolio is paying attention to that set of issues, and then they coordinate up to someone who's in the mayor's office. So where that coordination is possible, it's not possible given the structure of some cities where is probably, but I think what we've seen is that in the LA case, I saw a lot of mayors. I left before the change of mayor, so I'm not sure what Karen Bass's approach would have been had I still been there. But there's always that danger when you're a political appointee that you only last as long as the mayor who appointed you. Absolutely.
Thank you. My question is, from your point of view, your knowledge of the greater Southern California region, do you see San Diego, Tijuana metro area, binational metro area, being an extension of the LA and greater Southern California region, or is it an opportunity to create its own unique identity?
I think of it much more as separate. I think there's a different and separate culture here that is transnational and distinct from Los Angeles. This is always a tricky question about where Southern California begins and ends. For Karen McWilliams, who I quoted from earlier, he really saw the entire region from south of the Tehachapi, so Santa Barbara, basically south to the border, as Southern California. I think there are distinct and distinct subcultures within that massive region. It's important to think about the autonomy of each of those regions. So for me, when I come to San Diego and Tijuana, it feels distinct from LA. Of course, in the way that people move and the way that capital moves, it's not possible to say that with absolute certainty. But if your question is, should there be an effort to think about this San Diego-Tijuana relationship as distinct from the San Diego-LA one, I would say absolutely. because it does, I would hate to think of it as just part of that larger agglomeration, right? It does have, I would say architecturally, culturally, spatially, it has a distinct history.
Time. Unfortunately, we don't have time. Muchas gracias,
Oh,
Christopher.
thank you, my pleasure.
We still want to thank you for Christopher.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks so much. Yeah, thank you.
Sure, Christopher will be welcome to answer any questions on stage if you have them for him. Thank you for attending this session. There's plenty more amazing presentations for the rest of the day. Thank you.
Give you that.